young newlyweds come to pay their traditional wedding day respects at the eternal flame. They don't call it the Second World War here, they call it the Great Patriotic War. 20 million people died, and the memory of their sacrifice lives on in every Russian city. As a war leader, Stalin appealed directly to Russian patriotism. But more than one patriotic war was fought here. Then as now, the Soviet Union had many nations and many kinds of patriot.
Normandy, August 1944. Thousands of prisoners fell into Allied hands. They wore German uniform, but among them there were Russians, Georgians, Uzbeks, and Tatars.
The volunteers, of course, consisted of as many nationalities as you have in the Soviet Union. And that number is very great. But as a whole, it worked very well. The common cause of overthrowing the regime of Stalin was sort of a glue which put everything together.
Zwischen den Hakenkreuzfahnen der ukrainische Löwe. Schon vor 25 Jahren war er Symbol des Freiheitskampfes gegen Moskau.
The Waffen-SS Galicia Division. Ukrainian patriots who preferred Hitler to Stalin. Berlin, April 1939. Adolf Hitler celebrates his 50th birthday. The Nazis had ruled Germany for 6 years. The Führer's army was strong. His ambition was boundless. That summer, Hitler sent a delegation to Moscow to negotiate a pact with the Russians. A young diplomat, Hans von Herwarth, traveled with the foreign minister, Ribbentrop. Now retired at his family castle near Nuremberg, von Herwarth remembers the result of the mission.
Ribbentrop went to the Kremlin. I went to the house of the ambassador because I had to keep contact with the headquarters of Hitler. And I still remember when I took leave from my ambassador, he told me many people are congratulating me that this agreement has been signed. But in reality, I achieved nothing because now Hitler has the possibility to start the Second World War, and we will end in an abyss that will be the end of Germany.
It may seem now that the pact signed here in the Kremlin was a marriage made in heaven between two monsters who deserved each other. But at the time, it was a tremendous shock. Western communists went to sleep one night in August, declaring Hitler to be a fascist beast, and woke next morning to find his head on their pillow. Millions of people in hitherto independent countries soon found that they were now Soviet citizens.
Poland disappeared from the map, divided up between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. This Soviet newsreel film was entitled The Liberation of Poland. The people of eastern Poland were mainly Ukrainians. The Red Invasion was presented as a chance to rejoin their ancient homeland. The celebrations were organized by the chief of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, in the capital, Lvov.
Within very few days, we saw the changes in the appearance even of the town. A lot of posters appeared, and a lot of propaganda was blared on the radio about the superiority of communist system, about the wisdom of the Communist Party, and about our liberation, that we join the paradise on earth.
The same thing happened to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and 2 Romanian provinces. Stalin annexed them under a secret protocol to his pact with Hitler. By May Day 1941, the pact had given him a precious 20 months of peace. As Stalin took the salute in Red Square, Dunkirk, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, All these events were in the past. His army had been retrained and re-equipped since the punishing purges of the 30s, but the experienced officers who'd been shot had still not been replaced. Hitler had said, "This colossal empire in the East is ripe for dissolution." Operation Barbarossa, June the 22nd, 1941. A Soviet border unit radioed an appeal. "We are being fired on. What shall we do?" The reply from Moscow, "You must be insane, and why is your signal not in code?" "1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Luftwaffe called it infanticide." Eight hours after the first attack, the Soviet people heard Foreign Minister Molotov speak.
"Наше дело правое. Враг будет разбит. Победа будет за нами."
But in the Ukraine, the Germans were not automatically seen as enemies.
Salz und Brot als Zeichen der Gastfreundschaft.
The traditional greeting of bread and salt was offered by villagers sick of famine and terror. This is a German propaganda newsreel, but it did happen. A week after Barbarossa, the Germans arrived in Lvov.
June 41, the war broke out. Germans crossed the border. There was a sort of atmosphere of almost joy. The hope in the air, the evil will end, and some civilized people will come.
The city revealed a terrible secret.
There was a message on the radio from the Germans. It said, "Wives, mothers, brothers, sisters, come down to the prisons." I got to the entrance. I can't remember now which one. People were standing round on all sides of the gates. I could still see the bodies, though. They were lying in the courtyard, in rows.
Maria Seniva's husband was one of thousands imprisoned by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, during the 2 years of Soviet rule. In the panic which followed Barbarossa, the NKVD had butchered everyone. There were 3,500 dead.
I walked up and down the rows and I stopped to look at one of the dead bodies. It was covered by a blanket. I lifted the blanket and there he was. I'd found him. I don't know what had happened to him. But his face was all black. He had no eyes. Nothing there, and no nose.
After some time, the bodies were taken out and laid out in the yard, in rows, hundreds, thousands of them. And there I found my brother-in-law. I wouldn't have recognized him. He was half naked. There were signs of wounds on the body, and the face was all in black and blue and pulp. He was shot through the head. The hands were tied at the back with a piece of rope, And the only way I did recognize him when I saw the sock. He had the sock on his foot, one sock, colored in stripes. I recognized the knitting of my mother.
They put up these huge posters of Hitler everywhere. They said, "Hitler the Liberator." It sounds funny now, but then we really believed he might do something for our people, that we might get our freedom. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out like that.
Ukrainians and Russians soon learned the truth about the Nazis. In the wake of the regular army came the SS. They began to round up the Jews. Hitler dreamed of Lebensraum in the east, new living space for 100 million German supermen. It wasn't just the Jews that Hitler hated. He regarded the Slavs as subhuman too. As the German army took prisoners, Nazi newsreels paraded examples.
Hier eine kleine Auswahl besonders abschreckender Typen dieser bolschewistischen Untermenschen, die auf Befehl Stalins ganz Europa überschwemmen und Ordnung, Wohlstand und Kultur in Mord und Brand ersticken sollten.
In the first few months of war, the Nazis captured 4 million Red Army soldiers.
As the Soviet defenses collapsed, Stalin retreated to his dacha outside Moscow in a state of shock. For days he refused to speak to anyone. When he re-emerged, he had one new idea and one old one. The old idea was to shoot his unfortunate army commanders. The new idea was to appeal to Russians as patriots rather than communists.
We all got round the radio loudspeaker as Stalin's speech began. The first thing we heard was the clinking of a glass against a jug, and then water being poured into the glass. You could hear it so clearly. The water was poured out, Stalin took a gulp, and then he began to speak. Dear brothers and sisters, those first few words of his brought us so close to him, as though it was our own father speaking.
Stalin used every resource to encourage patriotic support for Soviet power and the Russian homeland. Here at the Holy Trinity Church in Moscow, services were permitted throughout the war. The Holy Trinity is next door to the factory where these women worked. As German bombers flew overhead, the workers got organized.
We slept here, lived right here at the factory. We never went home. When the air raid warnings went off, it was mostly at night. So a group of us from the Home Defence Brigade would run up onto the rooftop, and we'd all run round and just throw the firebombs off. So basically you could say that the safety of the factory building was entirely in our hands.
Of course we were frightened. These firebombs were blazing and throwing off sparks, and you had to go right up to them, grab them, run off with them and find somewhere to put them out. And those sparks could quite easily hit you, you know. They were flying off in all directions. So of course it was frightening. But after a while, we got very fierce. We'd pounce on the bombs, grab them by the tail and stick them straight into the water.
Well, nobody wants to die. Of course, it was frightening, especially when you're only 17. But you can get used to anything, can't you? By the end of the war, we were all quite fearless.
But in that first October, panic gripped the capital. With the Germans nearing Moscow, the party organized groups of women to dig trenches to stop the German advance. The remains of the women's work are still visible today in the country outside the city. Thousands of Muscovites were fleeing in terror, and the government was evacuated. Those who stayed were put to work.
We dug anti-tank trenches. They were huge, about 8 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Big as that. It was mostly us women who did the work. It was hard labor. We had to light fires to warm the earth up before we could dig into it. The earth was frozen solid on top, but deeper down it wasn't so hard.
It was freezing cold. There was a terrible frost, but you had to keep digging. They made us dig. We had to do it, and we did. We kept digging.
They were bombing us all the time, and the Germans dropped leaflets on us. They said, "Surrender, Moscow is kaput." We didn't believe it.
40% of the population of the empire was now under German occupation. On the frosty night of November the 6th, the Moscow Party faithful gathered in the metro. Stalin and his general staff were the only members of the government left in the capital.
I don't know how the roof didn't fall in. There was such an ovation. People clapping and stamping their feet for ages, so overjoyed that the leader of our country, the leader of our party, had come. Stalin was here at such a difficult time. He was a very busy man. His time was very precious. He pulled out his pocket watch. It was like a little ball, and held it up by its chain. He didn't say a word, just held it there. And everybody immediately understood that there was no time to waste. A deathly silence fell in the hall, as if there wasn't a soul there. That's how quiet it was.
The next day was the anniversary of the revolution. Stalin spoke to the soldiers.
На вас смотрят все народы Европы, временно подпавшие под иго немецкой тирании, как на своих освободителей. Великая освободительная миссия выпала на вашу долю. Будьте же достойны этой миссии. За полный разгром немецких захватчиков, смерть немецким оккупантам. Да здравствует наша славная Родина, ее свобода, ее независимость. Под знаменем Ленина вперед к победе!
They marched straight to the front. In the coldest winter for years, these men denied Hitler his entrance into Moscow. "300 armaments factories were now under German occupation. To modernize and extend its tank force, the Soviet government had to fight on an industrial front too. The planned economy had failed to get modern tank designs produced quickly enough. And as the Germans advanced, the workers at the Kirov arms factory in Leningrad were enlisted in a bold and desperate scheme.
The factories had been run in a military spirit for years. All those shock workers, storming fortresses, opening new production fronts. Now the command economy was face to face with a real war. And it turned out that though the planners were not very good at planning, they were remarkably good at improvisation.
Leningrad was under fierce bombardment as the Germans threw a siege around the city. As winter closed in, there was no fuel, no electricity. Strict rationing was in force. People were beginning to die.
I lost my entire family's ration cards. I sobbed, I screamed, I howled, I ran round and round. I jumped on a tram and ran up and down it screaming, "Give me my ration cards, give them back." I realized, even though I was only 14, that my family would starve. We were all going to die. And so we really were overjoyed to be evacuated to Chelyabinsk.
Alexandra Frolova was one of 10 million people who made the journey east. All over Russia and the Ukraine, whole factories were loaded onto trains to Siberia and Central Asia. In Chelyabinsk, the Leningraders built the guns and tanks to beat Hitler.
I started at the factory on the 16th of January 1942. You could see people standing in the snow and frost, working in the open air. Filthy. Tanks everywhere. I just can't begin to tell you how dreadful it all was. I felt the horror and fear welling up inside me, all over again. There really was a war going on. They took me to the shop to start work. Lathes, lifting cranes, people running around, desperate, worried, sad. And who were they, these people? Children. Nearly all the workers were underage children or old women.
If the front needs it, we'll make it. The workers renamed their new home. Instead of Chelyabinsk, they called it Tankograd. Here they built the celebrated and revolutionary tank called the T-34. The Chelyabinsk factory had built tractors before the war. Now it builds tractors again. The workers from Leningrad made the changeover.
Tractors are just like tanks. They've got the same diesel engine, the same transmission, caterpillar tracks, and lots of other similar features. If it's got no armour plating, it's a tractor. Put a machine gun on top and it's a tank. There are differences, of course, but generally speaking, they're very similar. So we started to make tanks. At the beginning, we were producing 3 tanks a day. By the end of the war, when the time came to take Berlin, we were making up to 35 tanks a day. That's a whole tank battalion every single day.
The people from Leningrad who escaped to Chelyabinsk were the lucky ones. The workers they left behind were dying. Hitler regarded Leningrad as the birthplace of Bolshevism. He sentenced the city to death. By the end, 630,000 people would die of cold and starvation. The siege around the northern capital was to last nearly 900 days. In the autumn of 1942, the British Prime Minister went to Russia to meet his allies.
Whatever our suffering, whatever our toils, we will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground, until the memory only of it remains as an example and a warning for future time.
As he entered, the Prime Minister gave his famous V sign for the cameramen's benefit.
Behind the smiles, their alliance was acrimonious. Winston Churchill told Stalin there would be no second front in France to relieve the Red Army. And Hitler was throwing massive forces against the city which bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad fought for 5 long months from the autumn of 1942. Men battled for every street, every house, every brick. Stalin gave the order, not a step back. The city was in ruins, but Stalingrad was a splendid and symbolic victory for the Red Armed Forces, who now included a group of women fighting in the front line.
We were taken in to meet the commander. He asked, "Well, have you brought me any pilots?" They said, "Yes, here they are." "Strange," he said, "I don't see any pilots in here." I felt terrible. But on the next day, they sent me out into action. They transferred me onto fighter bombers, the Stormovik. The Stormovik is not a plane for ladies. It's armour-plated. It can take up to 600 kilos of bombs, and it carries 2 machine guns.
The bomber designer Tupolev spent his war making aeroplanes in a Stalinist prison, one of thousands of scientists like engineer Meir Mordukovich still in the camps as a result of the purges.
During the war in 1943, my prison sentence came to an end. A secret police chief came to see me. He said, "We can't let you go, Stalin's orders. While there's a war on, no release for prisoners guilty of your offense. When you're doing work you love, it's not so hard. You can sit over it all night long and still not get tired of it." So everybody worked with a will. And of course we realized we were working for the good of our country. The fact that we'd been arrested and put in prison didn't put us off. We were still patriots.
Stalin told the American ambassador, "We are under no illusion that they are fighting for us. They are fighting for Mother Russia." The greatest tank battle in history. Hitler had said, "The victory at Kursk must shine like a beacon to the world." He lost. It was the summer of 1943, the turning point. In the occupied areas, the party stepped up the organization of partisan bands among the civilian population. Soviet partisans were trained in sabotage and based in woodland hideouts. Germans killed thousands in reprisal. Hitler said, "The struggle against the partisans in the entire East is a life and death struggle in which one side or the other must be exterminated." The partisans became legendary for their valor and patriotism. But the woods of Belorussia and the Ukraine held another kind of partisan, another kind of patriot.
The Ukrainian Insurgent Army formed. I was one of the founders. It was conspiratorial, underground. But then open clashes with the Reds began. They started it. As the front got closer, Red partisans started to encroach on our territory. They attacked us. I was given the task of defending the borders of the forest. All our units moved into action against the Soviet troops. As we saw it, they were occupying our country.
Greece was arrested and sent to the camps. The tide was turning. The Red Army were welcomed in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov as liberators. Their first job was to smoke out the headquarters of the Nazi authorities which had held the town for 2 years. SS and Gestapo officers were put on public trial. Among the accused was Mikhail Bulanov, a Ukrainian collaborator. Bulanov confessed to taking part in the mass murder of women and children at the city hospital. 3 Nazis were sentenced to death alongside Bulanov, the collaborator. They had been responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of citizens. The Soviet liberation swept on. In the spring of 1944, the Red Army reached the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Tatars had lived under German occupation for 2 years. German officers had courted the support of the Muslim population.
The population was very, very friendly because one of our first measures was to reopen the mosques, the Islamic churches, so to speak. That, of course, won the sympathy of the local population. The Tatars, of course, had to pay very heavily for their friendly attitude towards us.
The Crimean port of Sebastopol was liberated on May the 9th, 1944, after a ferocious battle. Nazi rule was over. The search for collaborators began. Everywhere in the south, liberation was followed by partisans coming down out of the hills to their newly liberated towns and villages. Even heroes like these fell under suspicion. This family of Tatars from the Crimea survived a terrible retribution.
It was the middle of the night, about 3 a.m. An officer and 2 soldiers came in. They gave us 15 minutes, that's all. Take only what you can carry, they said. You're to be exiled from the territory of the Crimea. We were shaking from head to foot with fear. We'd seen how the Germans threw live people, Jews and Crimeans, down the well. So when our own soldiers came, we were in such a state. Exile? Where to? We'll all be shot. I was saying, I'll take this with me. My sister threw it aside. She said, what are you taking that for? You're going to your death. But maybe we won't die, I said. We took whatever we could manage. There were only us women, no men, except the old ones. They loaded us all into wagons, cattle wagons.
Abliakimova and the entire Crimean Tatar nation were declared guilty of collaboration. Thousands died in the cattle wagons which expelled them from the Crimea to Siberia and Central Asia.
It's almost 46 years ago now, but I can still remember all the little sacks, the bundles, the packages which had been tied up in the Crimea. People never unpacked them. Everybody was hoping we'd be sent back. Every day we heard news, I don't know. Maybe they made it up because they wanted to believe it. But the news was always that we'd be going home, tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
By my calculations, 20,000 railway wagons were tied up for months, at a time when every effort was needed for fighting total war. But waste and cruelty combined were the hallmarks of high Stalinism. Just as individuals became unpersons in the terror of the 1930s, so now whole countries became unnations. The Crimean Tatars were written out of the history books. It was as though they had never existed.
A 1.5 million people from 8 small nations suffered the same punishment. These are the Kalmyk people who lived on the shores of the Caspian Sea. All the women and children were sent to Siberia. Their men were thrown out of the army. Lenin once said, "Kalmyk brothers, the entire past of your people is an uninterrupted chain of suffering." November 1944, the anniversary of the revolution, at the end of a year when almost all the empire was liberated. Victory was approaching. But several million men and women were in the hands of the Germans. Stalin regarded them all as traitors and dead men. His own son, Yakov, had died a prisoner of war. Soviet prisoners of war starved and died in Nazi camps. Millions were put to work or served in the German army. Some volunteered, some were forced. All were deemed traitors. Heroism in the field was no defense against the charge.
They shot at me again and again. My plane caught fire. I came round. I was falling out of the sky without a parachute. I lay on the ground. There was a German standing over me. He put his boot on my chest. But you know, the physical pain wasn't as bad as the emotional horror I felt. The horror that I was in the hands of the fascists. Better if they'd killed me. That's how I felt. They tried to get me up, but I kept falling. My leg was broken, my arm was broken, my legs were all burnt, my arms, my face, all burnt.
In January 1945, Timofeeva's prisoner of war camp was liberated by the Red Army. Still badly injured, she was interrogated on suspicion of spying.
It had been going on for 10 days, and that was it. I cracked. I ran upstairs. There was a guard, a soldier. He ran after me shouting, "Stop, or I'll shoot," but I ran on. I was out of my mind completely. I ran into the office of the major there and started screaming, "Shoot me, I can't stand it any longer. What happened to Soviet power? What's happened to it?"
One group of soldiers hoped to use the war to overthrow the injustice of Stalinism. The Russian Liberation Army was led by an idealistic Soviet captive, General Andrei Vlasov. His men wore the red, white and blue of pre-revolutionary Russia, but they were part of the German army.
It was perhaps the last chance with arms to overthrow that terrible regime. Perhaps it was an illusion, to consider ourselves as a independent army that will decide its own strategy and whatnot. Of course, we depended on the Germans, but there was no sense of collaborating with Germans. It was anti-Soviet and pro-Russian. It sounds like being very naive nowadays, but we hoped, some of us hoped, that this war cannot stop as where it stopped, because it was only half of the evil was destroyed.
The Red Army was 15 miles east of Berlin when the Führer emerged from his bunker to make his last public appearance with boys of the Hitler Youth. It was his 56th birthday, April the 20th, 1945. Half a million Red soldiers poured into the city. The Soviet propagandist Ilya Ehrenburg urged the troops on. All the trenches, graves and ravines filled with the corpses of innocents are advancing on Berlin. The dead are knocking at the doors. Whirl round in circles and burn and howl in your deathly agony. The hour of revenge has struck. As the red flag flew, the Führer and his new bride, Eva Braun, killed themselves. In Moscow, Sergeant Egorova was on telephone duty.
The sergeant major said, "What's up? An air raid?" "The war's over," I said. "Don't be stupid." "No, the war's over." And I ran off to the unit commander. The sergeant major was still standing there, wondering whether it was all true or if I'd gone mad. The commander came out. "What's happened?" he asked. I told him, "Comrade Captain, the war's over." All the girls started to screech. They flew towards me, hugged me, kissed each other, hugged each other, shouted, wept. That was how the war ended.
The 9th of May, 1945, Victory Day. It would be many years before the true horror of their wartime losses was revealed. After 1812, Russian soldiers presented the captured standards of Napoleon's army to the victorious Tsar Alexander I. In June 1945, Stalin stood in the pouring rain on the roof of Lenin's mausoleum as the Red Army threw the standards of the Wehrmacht at his feet. Among the returning heroes were Chuikov, victor of Stalingrad, Konev, first man into Berlin, Meretskov, savior of Leningrad. Stalin, generalissimo, his authority and prestige immeasurably swollen by victory. $20 million people had died. Soviet veterans take an enduring pride in the honor and achievement of their war against fascism. But in the Soviet Union, as everywhere in Europe, the survivors hoped for a new world.
Some people believe the victory over Hitler in some way redeems Stalin's barbarity. Many think he showed real talent as a war leader. I don't find either argument particularly helpful. The important thing is the Soviet people showed astonishing courage in the prosecution of their great patriotic war, and they were rewarded with what? With more of the same. For though the Soviet people won the war, the victor was Stalinism.
3 months before the war ended, Stalin played host to a crucial summit in the Crimean town of Yalta. At Yalta, the big three, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, met to negotiate the shape of post-war Europe. Churchill asked Stalin privately what he should do about the Russian prisoners still held in the West. The official record says Marshal Stalin hoped they could be sent to Russia as quickly as possible. The agreement was kept secret. There were 100,000 Russian prisoners in Allied hands. Nearly 20,000 of them, Cossacks who had fought on the wrong side, were held in this camp in Austria. Some were not Soviet citizens at all, but émigrés. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, said, "We cannot afford to be sentimental about this." British troops persuaded the Cossacks to hand in their guns. When the Cossacks realized what was happening, there were suicides. Men shot their families, mothers drowned their babies. Allied troops put thousands onto trains and handed them over to the Red Army.
Those nice-looking American chaps, you know, with big sticks chasing these wretched people to the cars. And they simply, just like children, they didn't understand what they were doing. Well, grim faces, everything lost, you know. I have no will to do something about it, no will to fight back. There's no longer any fighting spirit, even for your survival, left. And they were herded just like a herd of sheep. And this is what they looked like.
And many loyal Soviet prisoners of war fared little better.
When they started organizing our departure, we all rejoiced. The war was over. We were going home. The Americans gave all the Soviet troops a little suitcase with clean linen, but we didn't get to keep them, of course. There was a bridge we had to walk over. We saw secret police troops standing on the other side. Some men threw themselves into the water. Some tried to stop them and said, "Take what you've got with you." We arrived. They began to unload us. An escort was waiting. We climbed off our train. We saw what was written on the side. Traitors to the homeland.
Khrushchev was accused of spying. He got 10 years. The victory was so great, its price so terrible. There were happy endings. Fighter pilot Anna Timofeeva was rehabilitated.
My mother was told I'd been killed in action, and I was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. And it was only in 1965 that the Supreme Soviet finally let me have my gold medal. Hero of the Soviet Union.
Peredelkino, the home of Boris Pasternak. After the war, he returned to work on a novel critical of the communist revolution. It was called Dr. Zhivago. When it was published in 1957, he was attacked by Pravda as a self-infatuated Narcissus, a weed on Soviet soil. Boris Pasternak was not alone in being persecuted.
A monkey escapes from the zoo here and spends a day sampling the joys of Soviet life. At the end of the day, he decides he'd rather be back at the zoo. For writing that story, satirist Mikhail Zoshchenko was officially charged with rotten nihilism. The romantic poet Anna Akhmatova was expelled from the Writers' Union, accused of being a cross between a nun and a whore. The great composers Shostakovich and Prokofiev were condemned for not writing tunes that could be whistled by every worker.
Pasternak's hero, Dr. Zhivago, says a grown man must grit his teeth and share his country's destiny. In the post-war world, that is what the Soviet people had to do.
Vilna, former capital of Lithuania, which has been successively occupied by Poland, Russia, and Germany, has been virtually destroyed 4 times by war, which has periodically swept over it in its turbulent history.
As the war ended, the Red Army liberated millions of people from German occupation. In official newsreels, they welcomed the Red Army, but most waited to see what would happen. In the fields and forests of Lithuania, partisans had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Germans. Now they turned to face a new enemy, the occupying Red Army. Kazimiera Varkalete was one of those determined to fight on.
The
Russians arrived. We'd already heard about their government. They'd done terrible things. There was nothing good about them. Our men didn't want to join their army. We wanted to fight for Lithuania, not for the Russians. So our men went into the forest. They set up a resistance group. My brother and a friend hid away here. I brought them a machine gun I'd found. They repaired it and began to set themselves up as the Iron Wolf Group.
Josas Garzinskas joined the freedom fighters. They called themselves the Brothers of the Forest.
We came down this crisscross path. As we got closer, we could see that the soil was soft, so we picked a spot just here. This is where my friends and I started to dig our bunker, a secret bunker. It was difficult. We had to dig a deep hole. Then, because we couldn't disguise the earth we dug up, we had to carry it to a spot to hide it. At last, the bunker was ready. We started to live here, to hide away. It was impossible to find us.
Clad in motley uniforms, armed with captured or discarded weapons, the partisans played a deadly game of cat and mouse with Soviet security troops. Without the help of their countrymen, the Brothers of the Forest would not have survived. Kazimiera Varkalete was confronted one day by Soviet troops searching for partisans who were hiding under the barn.
They started throwing off the logs to try and find the bunker, but I was quietly throwing them back on to cover the air pipe, which was now sticking out. Their dogs were sniffing, but they didn't smell anything. They started to poke around, clearing away more logs. A few more and they would have found the bunker. They noticed I was throwing the logs around and said, if you're hiding bandits here, you'll die with them. No, there aren't any here, I said. Finally, they left. I ran and told the partisans what had happened. Did you hear anything? No, they said nothing. We were asleep.
you have to stay in the cold, in the wood, drenched. And very often you are surrounded by NKVD and local collaborators. And you have to escape, to fight. Sometimes you have to fight a group of partisans, consists of 12 people. And you face a 400-strong army.
The one-sided struggle went on into the 1950s. Sometimes the bodies of dead partisans were laid out in town squares. University lecturer Albinas Kentra has never forgotten the sight.
You see young, beautiful boys, and when you pass by, well, it might be your class friends, school friend. It might be your relation. It might be your brother. And you cannot look at for a long time at, you would be arrested. Mothers come and look at their sons, and they cannot show these were their sons. They would be arrested.
After the war, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Moldavia became Soviet republics. Eastern Poland was incorporated into the Ukraine. May Day, 1949. The Red Empire now equaled the Empire of the Tsars. The new Tsar, Joseph Stalin, who had masterminded the victory over Hitler, now called himself Generalissimo, great leader and teacher, father of the nation. His position seemed more secure than ever.
I believe that Stalin was the greatest person. Everybody else is just tiny, petty people. Some parents, by the way, told their kids that you should first love and respect Stalin, then your parents. He is your father.
When Marina Young was a schoolgirl, no one ever dared criticize Stalin openly, even within the family.
My brother of my mother told me something, not very, positive things about Stalin, by the way. My mother, I remember, was very much afraid and told him, don't say that, you don't know much about this or something, told him. But I remember I hated my uncle, just hated. He seemed like, beast or something. How can you not love Stalin?
Was a friend of mine, and I was talking to him, and he would say to me, that Stalin, if he wanted to be a writer, he would write novels better than Sholokhov. And I thought, yes, it's definitely. He's just too busy. He won't do it. But I believe that. He would be a better surgeon. He could be eye surgeon as good as Filatov, famous eye surgeon at the time. And I believed it. And I was almost ready to cry when I was thinking about Stalin. It was such a strong feeling, the reaction of feeling that there is a man who is smoking that pipe and who is thinking about us. Grandfather Stalin, and I remember reading in newspapers that, thank you, Comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood. It was just so strong.
The post-war Soviet Union settled into a Stalinist rut. Stalin only liked classical ballet, so great companies like the Kirov and the Bolshoi kept to a diet of approved works. Productions rarely changed, and sometimes sets and costumes were worn out by repeated performances. The party, ultimately Stalin, was the arbiter of taste. War memorials had to reflect the party's heroic leading role in the victory over fascism. Artist Tanya Litvinov was married to a sculptor.
My husband did lots of portraits. He was very interested in them. But again, they weren't right because they had to be a special angle of the head, you know, heroic, and he did them in a more quiet way. We were neighbors with Shostakovich and got friendly, and my husband did his head. But when the head of the arts committee, Hrabchenko, came to accept the portrait, he wouldn't, because he said, we want Shostakovich, the optimist. And my husband showed all his tragic. As a matter of fact, it was the best portrait of Shostakovich and the best portrait my husband ever did.
Academic orthodoxy was rigidly enforced. Students had to pass exams on their knowledge of Stalin's short course on the history of the Communist Party. The new enemy was cosmopolitanism, infection with decadent bourgeois Western ideas. The campaign reached its height in 1948. A charlatan appeared, promising Comrade Stalin a miracle, bountiful harvests to end forever the food shortages that plagued the Soviet economy. Biologist Trofim Lysenko denied the existence of genes and rejected Western theories of heredity. With Stalin as his patron, Lysenko dealt Soviet agriculture and science a blow from which it has never fully recovered.
All invention, all great invention in the world should be done by Russians. For example, radio was invented by Russian Popov, not by Marconi, as anybody in the world knew. And aircraft was invented by Mazhaysky, but not Brother Wright, as anybody knew. Scientists couldn't refer in their dissertations, in their books on foreign scientists, on foreign researchers, because it was cosmopolitanism. They should refer only to Russian scientists. It was absolutely crazy situation in culture and in science.
But some Western ideas were not unwelcome to Stalin. Soviet atom scientists relied on Western defectors and spies for the data they needed to build an atomic bomb. August the 22nd, 1949, the Soviet Union broke the American monopoly of nuclear weapons. Stalin now had the power to kill millions of foreigners. He had been killing millions of his own people for years.
Nadezhda Sergeyevna Alliluyeva Stalin, Stalin's second wife. There are historians who say that Stalin sometimes came here to the Novodevichy cemetery to sit at the grave of the woman he had driven to suicide. Others say he never did anything of the kind. If historians can't agree about one simple fact, how can they answer the really big questions? Like, did Stalin ever regret what he had done to the Soviet people in whose name he ruled? If he did, he never showed it.
1953 began with the unmasking of yet another plot against the Soviet state. Doctors working in the Kremlin hospitals were accused of planning to wipe out the Soviet Union's political bosses, including Stalin. Many of the accused were Jews, and a wave of government-inspired anti-Semitism swept the country. One of those under suspicion was Yakov Rapoport. The secret police came for him.
The officer was speaking very calmly,
as though he'd come to take me to a sanatorium. He said to my wife, "He won't need that or that. Sort out a pair of socks, some hankies." He was so calm. Then we went out and down the stairs. The other officers stayed behind to conduct a search here in my flat. As we walked down the stairs, the officer said to me, "If we meet anybody, just tell them you're going on a business trip." I almost burst out laughing. Who on earth will believe that in the middle of the night, accompanied by the secret police, I'm going on a business trip? It was so stupid.
Officers of the secret police searched the flat and found Dr. Rappaport's heart medicine. His daughter Natalia remembers their reaction.
When they saw this skull and crossed bones on the ampulla, it was like an explosion of a bomb. They got so excited, they decided that they found a poison in the apartment of a killer, of Dr. Killer. They took this ampulla, they put it in a small box, and they put a seal, and then they put this small box into the bigger box, and another seal on it. And the person in military uniform asked my mother, how many people is it possible to kill with this ampule? And my mother answered that nobody can be killed with one ampule of atropine. It is just a medicine.
The doctors and their families were reviled as enemies of the people.
Already there was a rumor that he took pus from corpse of people who died from cancer, and he put this pus onto the healthy people in trams, in buses, and in such a way he made these people ill with cancer.
Dr. Rappaport was held in the Lubyanka prison. A show trial was being prepared, but a few weeks after his arrest, he was summoned by the commandant.
He asked me, "How do you feel, Yakov Lvovich?" I shouted back at him, "Well, how do you think a man would feel in my situation?" He kept looking at me, pacing up and down his office. "The thing is, I've called you in to inform you that your case is now closed."
March the 5th, 1953. The supreme leader and teacher, father of the nation, Coryphaeus of science, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, was dead.
It was a personal tragedy, and we heard it on radio that Stalin died, and I was just crying, and I just couldn't believe that it happened, and I felt orphaned. And there was a meeting at high school where I was, and during that meeting, a boy standing next to me smiled, and I started to beat him, and somebody had to hold me because I just couldn't believe that you could smile at that day.
I remember sitting up all night in front of the window, which looked onto the Kremlin, and thinking, what will happen now? And then suddenly, about 4 or 5 in the morning, a brilliant thought crossed my mind that nothing could be worse than it has been. And I felt very, very happy.
The prisoners of the Gulag rejoiced. In the Vorkuta mining camps above the Arctic Circle, they refused to go to work. Appeals for support from other camps were scrawled on the side of coal wagons. The unrest spread. The camp administration reacted violently.
Somebody gave the command fire. The shooting didn't last long, about 3 minutes. But they were using all sorts of weapons, automatics, rifles, machine guns. They fired straight into the crowd. There were over 2,000 men in the camp. The ones in the front line by the gates were killed straight away. They all still lie here. 62 people died that day, and they're all buried here.
Mourners were crushed to death as they queued to pay their last respects to Stalin. For Stalin's closest colleagues in the Politburo, his death was timely. There were signs that the old tyrant had been planning a major purge of the party leadership. The Politburo immediately began the rehabilitation of prisoners. Dr. Rappaport telephoned to say he was coming home.
A minute later, it was a sound of lift, and the dog was like Sphinx. He was sitting in front of the door and waiting for my father to come. And she didn't like anybody to come up to the door. She was waiting. She was the first person in this meeting. And when there was a call in the door, my mother opened the door, and the dog jumped from the floor up to the height of the face of my father, like this. And she was crying, ah, ah, ah. It took time for my mother to come up to my father and to kiss him. It was, her turn was the second one, and my turn was the third one.
When Stalin died, Lavrenti Beria, feared head of the secret police, looked the man most likely to succeed. He alone among the grey men of the Politburo seemed strong enough to assume power. But the Politburo feared another reign of terror. The last thing they wanted was someone with Beria's bloody record as head of the party and the state.
The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, repository of orthodoxy, assuming you're reading the current edition. This is volume 5 of the second edition. In the summer of 1953, subscribers received an odd letter. It instructed them to cut out, with scissors or razor blade, pages 21 to 24 and replace them with new ones. These new pages contained pictures of the Bering Sea and an article on a hitherto neglected 18th century courtier called Bergholz. The old pages had an article on Beria, who had now, in true Orwellian tradition, become an unperson.
Politburo members Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov had Beria arrested. He was eventually shot as a British spy. The contest for the leadership was now between these two. Khrushchev came out the winner. The memory of Joseph Stalin still dominated Soviet life. Khrushchev wrote, "For 3 years we were unable to break with the past, unable to muster the courage and the determination to lift the curtain and see what had been hidden from us about the arrests, the trials, the executions, and everything else that had happened during Stalin's reign." One evening in February 1956, the Reuters correspondent in Moscow had a visit from an agent of the KGB. He offered John Retty the scoop of the century.
He arrived in my flat. We put on loud music, just in case of the microphones, and he then began to tell me this amazing tale of Khrushchev denouncing Stalin as a murderer and a torturer, and an absolute devil incarnate. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. I had pages of notes that he'd given me out of his head. He had nothing written down, but he was very well briefed. So I phoned my colleague in Reuters, for whom I was working at the time, and said, I've got to meet you. So we met outside the Central Telegraph Office, and we stayed outside because of the microphones. And we tramped through the snow of Moscow while I recounted this tale to him, pausing under the lamplight to read my notes and crunching on. I suppose we were about 2 hours outside talking about it, and in the end we had to decide whether we accepted the story or not. It did fit with the rumours we'd heard in embassies and so on, and this fellow did have some credentials from giving me information before. So we decided we did believe it, and when I would go out to Stockholm the next day, I'd take the notebook burning holes in my pocket on the plane and file it from Stockholm.
Gathering in the Kremlin, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party springs a surprise on the world. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled Russia for a quarter of a century, is publicly criticized for the first time. The critics include Premier Bulganin, his predecessor Malenkov, and Party Secretary Khrushchev. Khrushchev and his colleagues tell the delegates that for 20 years the party has suffered in all its work from one-man rule. Now, they announce, collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy is promised.
It was Khrushchev who pushed through what came to be known as the secret speech. His son-in-law remembers the reaction.
There was dead silence in the hall. At first, everybody was just shocked. After some time, once it had sunk in, you could hear cries of shame, disgraceful. The old communists were crying. People who recognized the names of their relatives and realized their fate wept.
At party meetings, the speech was read out. Khrushchev addressed a gathering here in Moscow's Hall of Columns, scene of many of Stalin's show trials.
Khrushchev was standing here when he was handed a note which read, "How could you, members of the Politburo, allow such grave crimes to be committed in our country?" Khrushchev read out the note and glared down the hall. "This note is not signed. Stand up, the person who wrote it." Nobody moved. "The person who wrote this note is frightened," said Khrushchev. "Well, we were frightened to stand up against Stalin."
Khrushchev, a disciple of Stalin, had finally had the courage to stand up and be counted. The madness was over. Khrushchev set out to dismantle Stalinism. He opened up the Kremlin for parties and shut down the Gulag, the slave labor system that had been the backbone of the Soviet economy for nearly 3 decades. American-born George Green had been imprisoned for spying.
During the Khrushchev time, when he decided to let the people out, practically everyone who was not tried officially by a court but went through the Ossofer term were released. And I was among them. I was given a small slip of paper, about a quarter of a regular-sized sheet of your notebook, on which said that due to the unnecessity for further detention, to be released without having a judgment. And said I could go wherever I wanted. They gave me money for a one-way fare. I said, "Where do you want to go?" "To Moscow." And they gave me a ticket to Moscow, and I came to Moscow.
George Green and his wife Helena were among the millions released that summer of 1956. When they arrived in Moscow, they found a desperate housing shortage. People lived in communal flats shared by several families, as another former camp inmate recalls.
There were 23 people, 6 families, and I had a room which was 7 square meters. The worst thing was that you have 1 lavatory, 1 bathroom, and 1 kitchen. I mean, if you just can't imagine that everybody before going out wants to go to the lavatory,
at the same time, and you have 23 people banging at the door like mad, not only that you can't sit there, but you can't even, collect your thoughts. In communal flat conditions, I don't think one can call it peace and quiet. I remember a mother throwing into her husband, who was the father of the family, a kettle with boiling water, and it somehow landed on him. The father was chasing that poor mother, and I remember she jumped into my room, hiding from him. He was chasing her with an axe. And the children, for example, the young man, probably had girlfriends, but there was no way they could meet because you haven't got hotels, you haven't got a room on your own. And they lived 6 people, and they were good-looking young men who could never, ever bring anybody home because there were 6 people in one room, which is half of where we are now.
Khrushchev abandoned Stalin's monumental building plans. Instead, Soviet cities were surrounded by forests of cranes and muddy building sites. Over the next 10 years, the housing stock doubled. The program had a curious side effect.
It was the time when company flourished. It was the time when almost every evening we gathered in companies, not only to sing, to dance, but to speak with each other, to produce our new values. We needed it strongly, and discuss our past and our future.
In the newly constructed flats, the quest for forbidden knowledge spawned a secret industry, the illicit copying and distribution of banned books. It was known as samizdat.
I personally got involved in samizdat. We started, because I didn't have a typewriter at home and was a bad typist, we would buy a camera and would take a picture of every page of a novel, like Dr. Zhivago, for example, was one of the things, and would take a picture of every page, and then would do it with my friend, and then would print. It was very thick paper. So the Dr. Zhivago was several boxes of that paper of this size. And after we will get a tape, film, and then this film will give it to some other friends in Leningrad who would do the same thing. And then we would invite all our friends to some kind of party where everybody would read because somebody else would want to read next night. So we would start passing it around, and somebody will have first page, second page. So there were such kind of samizdat parties. I remember them. People would not drink vodka, wouldn't do anything. They will drink tea and will just quietly read page after page after page. That was extremely exciting times.
Pasternak finished Dr. Zhivago in 1955. Banned in the Soviet Union, it was published in the West in 1957 and became an international bestseller. What happened next showed there were limits to Khrushchev's liberal reforms. In October 1958, Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Olga Ivinskaya was his lover and the model for Lara.
His first reaction was one of humility, pride, and joy. He sent a telegram to that effect to the Swedish Academy. But then outside pressure built up to such an extent that in the end he was forced to turn the prize down. They ran a campaign against him. His books were taken off the printing presses. A selected edition of his poems, about to come out, was stopped. All the publishing houses ripped up his contracts and sent them back. It began to affect me too, and Boris, unable to get any work anywhere, was driven to despair.
There is no way out for me. How dare I write such stuff? I, scoundrel and evildoer, who made the whole world weep at the beauty of my native land.
Khrushchev did a brave thing when he denounced Stalin. But the de-Stalinization policy was not a simple matter of liberal conscience. Khrushchev used it blatantly to impose his will on the rest of the party hierarchy. The little man of the people in his baggy trousers seemed to be firmly in charge.
He put his supporters, like wartime comrade Leonid Brezhnev, into the Politburo. The Stalinist old guard were in retreat. They mounted one last effort to overthrow Khrushchev, but it failed. Fearing the worst, one of the plotters telephoned the Kremlin to plead for his life. Khrushchev told him, "You measure others by your own yardstick. You will be able to live in peace if you work honestly, like all Soviet people." He kept his word. The bloodletting had stopped. Young people were inspired by Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. They decided it was time to join the party. It provided a much-needed transfusion of new blood. Khrushchev mobilized their enthusiasm for a crusade to tackle the chronic food shortages. As so often with his plans, it was supposed to offer an instant solution. He looked to the east, to the so-called virgin lands of Kazakhstan and Western Siberia. Khrushchev called on young communists to help turn the steppe into the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Politburo member Leonid Brezhnev was put in charge. Early harvests were excellent. Khrushchev appeared to have overcome a problem that had plagued the Soviet Union since its creation. But the virgin lands were not as empty as they looked. The Kazakhs, persecuted and collectivized by Stalin 30 years earlier, once again stood in the way of Moscow's imperial plans.
They took our horses away from us, and we couldn't live without them. Without the meat, without their milk, but they didn't listen. They wouldn't let us breed anything, not a single cow or horse. Their only aim was to grow corn, which was no good for us at all. So you see, he didn't do any good for Kazakhstan.
Khrushchev bubbled with new ideas, picked up and discarded with bewildering speed. His speeches were peppered with exhortations to plant maize, Chinese millet, melons and other crops in areas where they won't grow properly. Later, his enemies were to call this harebrained scheming, but Khrushchev simply couldn't help interfering.
The managers of collective farms were bombarded with a bewildering barrage of directives issuing from the Kremlin. Stepan Oleynik was chairman of a collective farm in the Ukraine.
У нас в основному культивується це пшениця і буряки.
Our main crops had always been wheat and sugar beet, but he wanted maize. Maize and China millet and Russian dandelion. Basically, he'd chosen everything you can't grow here.
Ми ж були дожились до того уже, що в нас
We ended up with no bread.
кукурудзяний хліб. Причому хліб
We
ділили.
had to eat cornbread. And then they started rationing even that because everybody had sown maize, but it wouldn't ripen as they'd sowed the wrong sort.
Тому що це ж треба сорт підбирати для того, щоб... А чому за вообще у нас
In
нічого?
the end, we had no food at all.
Китайська культура.
There was this Chinese stuff we didn't know how to grow, and then there was Russian dandelion, which you need a very warm climate for, so that didn't work either.
Коротше говоря, а потім же ж він так.
Then they decided to destroy our grass crops. Orders came, no sowing of any grass crops. The whole thing was hopeless, and we didn't have any say in what was going on.
Я не знаю, як зараз ми дохазяйнуємося до чого.
Khrushchev reorganized education too. As part of their course, students had to work in factories or on collective farms for at least 3 days a week. Some got more of an education than the authorities bargained for.
The authorities obviously did not realize what they're doing, because we did get a certain sense what the life is about in the Soviet Union. For example, one of the things which puzzled us greatly is that the whole workforce in that factory was drunk by midday. And we, as the younger fellows around, were quite often sent off to buy vodka. The second thing which was puzzling, that whatever could be stolen from that factory by the workers always got stolen, including sometimes quite valuable things. But the biggest surprise for me was that they actually didn't produce anything. Even if a foreman gave an order to a worker to produce a certain amount of nuts and bolts, instead of producing them, he would secretly go around to a storage of the ready-made product, where behind of it, a couple of boards were already loosened by many others, would sneak into that, find the appropriate bolts and nuts, steal them, and bring them back to his foreman, saying that he just manufactured them. So that was the first sense, the first feeling that this vast country, with all these quotas and socialist competitions and all the hullabaloo, doesn't produce anything.
In October 1957, the Soviet Union astonished the world by being the first to put a man-made object into space. A tiny satellite called Sputnik was successfully placed in an orbit 200 miles above the Earth. Everyone soon knew its call sign.
I was never bombarded with so much propaganda as the morning when I got up and heard the news about the first Sputnik. Everywhere in the capital, every street, they had these banners in the shop saying, "We are first in the world. We have surpassed America."
Robert Robinson had been living in the Soviet Union for almost 30 years, but when it came to Sputnik, he was still a foreigner.
Just come to you and say, "Have you seen the Sputnik? We have surpassed America. How you like it?" Or they would see me about passing me. They would say, "Beep, beep, 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 beep," just like the Sputnik was, pass. Whenever you heard beep, beep, to call my attention.
The Soviet Union maintained its lead in space. In 1958, a dog called Laika was sent into orbit. Unable to return to Earth, she became the first martyr of the Soviet space program.
Как не радоваться успехам наших людей? Хотелось бы крепко обнять этих замечательных товарищей, которые своим трудом и творческим гением прославляют нашу советскую родину.
When the scientists first showed us one of the rockets, we thought it looked like nothing but a huge cigar-shaped tube, and we didn't believe it would fly, wrote Khrushchev. We were like peasants in the marketplace. We walked around the rocket, touching it, tapping it to see if it was sturdy enough. We did everything but lick it to see how it tasted.
Зажигание.
greatest achievement came on April the 12th, 1961. The first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, lifted off from the Soviet Space Center in Central Asia. During his 108-minute orbit of the Earth, he delivered revolutionary greetings to the countries below. A hero of socialist labor in the 1930s remembers the space hero of the 60s.
When our darling Yuri Gagarin walked into our lives, he seemed so extraordinary. What he did was an achievement for everybody. You see, Yuri always said that his flight was not just down to him personally, that so many people had worked to make it a success. He was so grateful. I can't explain how we felt. There were crowds all over Red Square. Everybody was shouting, "Our Yuri in space! Our Yuri! Who will be next?" It was such a triumph. We were so incredibly happy, as though you'd made the flight, as though I had. It was a joy we all felt.
Khrushchev basked in the reflected glory of Gagarin's flight. Eventually, Khrushchev's successors would have him erased from the photographs of the occasion. But all that was in the future. At the 22nd Party Congress in the summer of 1961, a young Mikhail Gorbachev, attending his first gathering, heard a confident Khrushchev applaud the achievements of the party. The new party program proclaimed that socialism had been achieved. Communism would arrive within 20 years. But there was one last piece of unfinished business.
At the 22nd Party Congress, a woman delegate, a veteran of the revolution and former inmate of a labor camp, made an extraordinary speech. She concluded, and I quote from the party record, "I always hold Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in my heart, and always, comrades, at my worst moments, I only survived because Ilyich was in my heart and I could consult him." Loud applause. "Yesterday I consulted Ilyich as though he stood alive in front of me, and he said, 'It is unpleasant for me to be in the mausoleum next to Stalin, who brought so much grief to the party.'" Loud, prolonged applause. That very night, Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum. His name was erased from the maps.
Novocherkassk, South Russia, the old capital of the Cossacks on the River Don. One summer's day in June 1962, a workers' demonstration came marching past Leonid Tolstoletov's balcony.
I could hear them chanting, "Freedom, freedom," but I didn't understand what it was they wanted, what they were all on about. There was a huge crowd, some carrying banners with slogans. But it was this chant, "Freedom, freedom," which really caught my attention. They marched up to the first line of soldiers. They let them through. There was a second line of soldiers, and they let them through too.
The third line of soldiers opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators. The massacre at Novocherkassk was kept secret. Nobody here has ever talked about it. It began at the electric engine works. the biggest train factory in the empire, employing 10,000 people. On the 1st of June 1962, the morning shift arrived to find that food prices had risen overnight by up to 30%. The workers downed tools. Someone set off the factory siren, and metal worker Piotr Siuda came in to find the Novocherkassk electric engine works on strike. Their demands were simple and clear.
A big poster went up here. Two of the workers painted it. They brought it along and hung it up over there. It said, more meat, more butter, more housing. It was all directed personally against Khrushchev. They stopped a train at the station too and wrote a slogan on it. We'll have Khrushchev for sausages.
Next morning, thousands of demonstrators marched to the town centre. They arrived at the local party headquarters. Inside, local communists were entertaining party bosses from Moscow. Some of the demonstrators got into the building and took action.
Our comrades came out of the party offices onto the balcony carrying a tray. There were half-drunk bottles of cognac on it and empty glasses, sausage and all sorts of other tasty tidbits. These comrades wanted to show the rest of us standing down here what our leaders were up to.
By now, the square was full of people. There were soldiers guarding the party building. The mood was tense. Children had climbed into the trees to get a better look.
Then the shooting started. They were firing warning shots. They fired into the trees, but there were kids sitting up there. Well, you know how curious kids are. I didn't see the children fall, but I heard them. Crying, screaming, sobbing children. I could hear it all from where I was standing at the edge of the square. I heard it all.
It's not clear whether the soldiers were ordered to shoot or whether they panicked. Inside the party headquarters, there were desperate calls to Moscow. Major Yuri Vnukov arrived to take charge of the clearing up.
In the middle of the square was a pool of blood. We didn't count how many people had been killed. They called in the fire service to try and clean the blood up. They hosed it down, but it wasn't any good. During the night, the blood had dried into the tarmac on the square. So we sent for a lorry load of sand and 10 cleaners. When they came, we used the hoses and the sand and scrubbed it all with brushes. We managed to clear up the worst of the blood and restore some sort of order. There were bits and pieces of clothing lying all over the square. Jackets, shawls, caps, all sorts of hats, boots. So we swept them all up, put them in a lorry and carted them away.
What amazed me was we'd been brought up from childhood to believe that this is the land of socialism, the USSR, which puts human beings first. I would never have believed that here, right here in this square, they could shoot their own people point blank. I just couldn't believe it.
The dead were buried in unmarked graves in secret places. The graves have never been found. The number of dead has never been admitted.
Верные всепобеждающему учению марксизма-ленинизма мы смело идем вперед, и нет такой силы в мире, чтобы остановить это движение народов к светлой цели.
Khrushchev was not as safe as he looked. He had tried hard to increase food production with innovative farming policies. But his determination to plough up the virgin lands of Central Asia and Siberia ended in disaster. It was too much too soon. Half the virgin lands ended up a dust bowl. His budget problems forced Khrushchev to consider spending cuts. One obvious target, the armed forces. He demobilized millions of men and slashed military spending. Politically, he was isolated. International embarrassment was the last straw. Khrushchev and Fidel Castro faced the world together, but the party was losing patience. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an undignified public humiliation.
Khrushchev's enemies began to move in for the kill. He made things easy for them by continually putting his foot in it. One day he stepped across from the Kremlin to the Manège Gallery here. They showed him a room full of expressionist paintings. Of course he lost his temper. This one must have been daubed with a donkey's tail, he said. That one looks like the contents of a baby's nappy. It was an embarrassing scene.
There was one last great show of unity. His 70th birthday on April the 17th, 1964. He was awarded the medal Hero of the Soviet Union by head of state Leonid Brezhnev. Harebrained scheming, boasting, and empty words were the charges against the man who won the space race. The usual hero's welcome was laid on for the spacewalking cosmonauts on their return to Moscow. But as they marched down the red carpet, the newsreel camera never revealed exactly who was there to greet them. The men who'd called Khrushchev back from holiday and sacked him now formed a collective leadership. Khrushchev's fall from grace was sudden and complete. A teacher asked one of his grandsons what the old man did all day. Mostly, Grandad cries, the child said. He died peacefully after a walk in the woods to gather mushrooms. May Day 1965, and the new leadership presented itself to the nations of the USSR. Party and army had had enough of Khrushchev and his roller coaster. Now the watchword was stability. In particular, stability of jobs for communists. The new General Secretary was Leonid Brezhnev. He kept his job for 18 years. The new regime wanted to put the lid back on dissent after Khrushchev's thaw. Among the first to feel the effects of the new policy was the satirical writer Andrei Sinyavsky, now in exile in Paris.
I was arrested in broad daylight, in the street as I was coming out of the college where I used to lecture. Right there in broad daylight on a crowded street, they just whisked me away. Nobody in the crowd noticed. That's how skilled they were at arresting people. They just shoved me into a car. It struck me that nobody had noticed that someone had been arrested in the middle of the street.
Freedom of speech was theoretically guaranteed by the Soviet constitution. These arrests marked a new gap between theory and practice. Protesters gathered in Moscow's Pushkin Square on Constitution Day in December 1965.
The dissenters argued that a lot of the Soviet constitution was excellent in theory if only the government would stick to it. They raised placards saying, "Observe the Soviet constitution." The police responded by arresting them. The next demonstrators simply stood here and took their hats off. Of course, they were arrested too.
Sinyavsky and Daniel were the first writers ever to stand trial for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda.
The judge was worse than the prosecutor. He took every opportunity to help the prosecutor out. He wouldn't let me talk at all, kept on interrupting. I'd be trying to explain something to the court and he'd cut me off, move on to another question. I had the feeling they were just out to hunt me down. Apart from that, what shocked me, what shocks me to this day, was the reaction of the spectators in the court. They applauded the prosecutor. They applauded with glee when the sentence was read out. Even the writers were clapping. Of course, it was painful, but inside I had to laugh. Everything I'd written really was true. In fact, it was nothing compared to this fantastic scene.
Sinyavsky was in the camps when in August 1968 Brezhnev met Alexander Dubček. His talks with the Czechoslovak communists were described as a broad, comradely exchange of opinions.
In 1968, I was an officer of Red Army. I was on a border with Czechoslovakia. It was lots of troops. We are waiting 1 month, 2 months. It was a big tension, and nobody knows what will happen. So our political commissars explain what is the problem, and they explain to us what can be solution. The problem, according to them, is Western capitalists, British, American, West Germans, an internal Czechoslovakian counter-revolution try to destroy socialism in Czechoslovakia. All Czechoslovakian people like to protect socialism, and if Czechoslovakian people will ask us, we have to help them.
The Soviet troops sent to destroy the Prague Spring were surprised to find that they were not welcomed as liberators. The rape of Czechoslovakia left aggressors and victims in shock. In Prague, there were desertions. In Moscow, there were protests.
Clearly, it was a tremendous blow. Both, because for me it was two things that I was ashamed that my country abuses its small neighbor, 12 million people, and our country is 220 million or so. And we are abusing that little neighbor who didn't do anything except spoke up, because they even didn't do any reforms. They just started to speak about reforms, and suddenly we crushed them. But it also was the second undercurrent was that it was against our hopes for changing the Soviet Union.
Pavel Litvinov and a small group of friends made a brave gesture. They went to Red Square and unfurled banners opposing the invasion of Czechoslovakia.
On my banner, which I held, there was my favorite slogan, very important for me, for our and your freedom. It was a historical 19th century slogan which meant that no country can be free if it oppresses the other country. So for me it was very, very close. slogan, and there were other slogans. People were holding along the same lines, long live free and independent Czechoslovakia. It was very important to know that we were all followed by KGB. And today I have no doubts that KGB knew about our demonstration. And then these people started to run up to us. Probably it was the same KGB people or some other people who were running, and they started to yell at us immediately. And it was very important that they were carrying, the women were carrying shopping bags which were filled with something heavy. I think it were books. Some people thought it were bricks. And men had a very heavy suitcases. And they started to beat us on our heads because we were sitting down.
Among the protesters arrested that day on Red Square were the first editors of a brand new samizdat newspaper, The Chronicle of Current Events. New volunteers came forward to compile the only trustworthy source of opposition news.
The
first issues of the Chronicle tended to preach a bit. It was written emotionally. Then, gradually, the tone became more impartial, scientific, more reliable, accurate, scrupulous.
A lot of our information came like this. We weren't allowed into the courts, but the relatives were. They'd try and make a tape recording, either right there in the court if they could get away with it. If not then, immediately afterwards.
The editorial board, well, it wasn't a board really, just a small group of people who produced the issues. We would meet in one of our flats, or sometimes in the flat of a friend, to distract the attention of the KGB. And yes, we always tried to find a flat that wasn't bugged, because most of our flats were bugged. We can prove it too. It was very hard work, of course, completely exhausting.
For example, we couldn't make any noise at all because there wasn't supposed to be anyone in the flat. And that gave us serious problems. Even flushing the toilet became a major operation. Yes, one of us was a bit deaf. We had to talk loudly to him. But we managed. We'd pour water into the toilet little by little, so nobody could hear it flush.
Their enemy was the KGB. The Committee for State Security was the latest in a long list of names for the secret police. Soviet newsreels concentrated on their work as border guards, defending the physical frontiers of the empire. But these were the guardians of ideology, too. They were led by a dedicated, hard-working communist called Yuri Andropov, addressing graduates at the KGB Academy.
От чекиста требуется высокая идейная убежденность, непоколебимая преданность делу партии, готовность отдать ему все свои силы, а если потребуется, то и свою жизнь.
It's based on the ideology. They want you, as an individual, not only as a slave who works for them, like in ancient slavery. They want your soul, they want you to believe in them.
During a wave of arrests in 1972, Viktor Krasin was pulled in by the KGB. He was paraded before a press conference with his friend Pyotr Yakir. At their trial, they pleaded guilty and repented their previous slanders on the Soviet human rights record. They implicated about 200 other dissidents.
So when they broke us, our friends couldn't forgive us. And that's exactly what KGB wanted. To break the movement, to make people enemies.
In 1974, 2 Jewish dissidents were sentenced to death in Leningrad.
We have appealed for the lives and the freedom of the Jews.
They had tried to hijack an aeroplane to the west to gain publicity for the campaign to allow Soviet Jewry to emigrate to Israel. One of the hijackers was Edward Kuznetsov.
First of all, we were anxious to find a small plane to buy all tickets in order all passengers were only our friends, people who wanted to immigrate. And in order, there was no blood during this operation because we thought it very, very important that to show to the world that we are not real hijackers, we're just people who are in desperate situation and wanted to immigrate. It was our plan. And by the way, when we went to the airport at the last day when we were arrested, there was about a regiment of KGB, a real regiment of KGB border troops under every bush, under every tree with, binoculars and cars and so on, so many of them. So it was a very tricky game that we saw them and they saw that we saw them, and all of us pretended that nobody said it,
His death sentence was commuted to 15 years. By the time he arrived in Israel in 1979, 250,000 Soviet Jews had emigrated. KGB policy was now to get rid of troublemakers. Not all went willingly. The Nobel Prize-winning author Alexander Solzhenitsyn was arrested, deprived of Soviet citizenship, and thrown out of his homeland. His books continued to circulate in secret.
The Baikal-Amur Railway, a nationwide Komsomol construction job.
It was the showpiece of the 9th five-year plan, an alternative to the Trans-Siberian Railway. BAM would harness the energies of communist youth to the unexploited wilderness of the Soviet East. The young communist organization pledged its support at a special congress.
Товарищ генеральный секретарь Центрального комитета Коммунистической партии Советского Союза, мы выполнить важнейшее поручение партии готовы отдать все силы, знания, жар комсомольских сердец делу коммунистической партии, строительству коммунизма клянемся, 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 клянемся.
600 volunteers left Moscow on the 27th of April 1974. They were a vanguard representing the cream of the Komsomol. It was a glorious adventure, and for some, a 10-year commitment to a dream of socialist progress.
At the Congress, it was the call of the Komsomol. But at that moment, it felt like the call of the heart. It really did.
All
the railway workers in the country worked one day without pay so that we could travel for nothing. They even fed us for nothing. At all the big towns like Novosibirsk, Yaroslavl, huge crowds turned out to meet us. They gave us giant keys. From the taiga, they said, to the railway. And then they gave us a terrific send-off.
The plan to relieve the Trans-Siberian took a route north from Lake Baikal to Komsomolsk and the Pacific. 100,000 people went east, most of them young communist volunteers. They cut 3,000 kilometers of track through the hostile permafrost of the eastern Siberian forest, the taiga. It cost a fortune, but the heroic scale of the idea was not matched by investment in modern engineering technology. and the volunteers had more enthusiasm than skill.
The boss of our team, he built an airport and a railway station in Moscow. He was a master builder. He'd been in the business for years. Well, he said, what in hell's name did I take these bloody Komsomol volunteers for, when I could have had proper working men? You pay them, they work hard, and that's that.
We thought we'd be living in tents. We expected mud, cold, snow, mosquitoes. What we got was clean white sheets, hot running water. I know one girl who had hysterics. She said, I wanted the real taiga.
The first train. Faith in human effort and technological advance is an enduring theme in Soviet life. But some of these massive projects had appalling consequences. The Aral Sea in Central Asia in 1960. In 1987, by the year 2000. Once it was the fourth largest lake in the world. Now it is shrinking, salty, poisoned, dying. Soviet scientists call it an ecological black hole. The Aral Sea is drying up because the rivers which fed it for millions of years have been diverted. Now, massive irrigation schemes bring fertility to ancient deserts, to grow one of the most valuable cash crops in the world. Cotton. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s, cotton meant money, and it meant corruption on an astonishing scale. The man in the dock is Brezhnev's son-in-law, Yuri Churbanov. He was arrested in a notorious scandal involving cotton, diamonds, and the Moscow State Circus. He got 10 years. The trial in 1988 exposed graft, cruelty, and rot at the very top.
It's not only a question of dresses. Cotton has important military uses too. But even so, the problems of the peasants who grew it came low down the government's list of priorities. In fact, Soviet Central Asia was called Comrade Brezhnev's 101st problem.
Leonid Brezhnev went several times to Uzbekistan to meet the local party chief, Sharaf Rashidov, and to exhort the cotton growers to fulfill increasingly impossible production targets.
Товарищи употребляют термин и говорят всегда, говорят правильно, что дадут Родине столько-то тонн белого золота. Я хочу дополнить эту фразу, сказать так, что это золотые руки сделали белое золотым.
Выступает первый секретарь ЦК Компартии Узбекистана Рашидов.
Sharaf Rashidov spoke, first secretary of the Uzbek party. Brezhnev interrupted him and said, Sharaf, will you have 5.5 million tons? Rashidov hesitated. Come on, just round up the figures. Yes, said Rashidov, we will. Well, watch it, Brezhnev said. If you don't, that'll be the end of you. You'll be out of a job. A few years later, the same thing happened again. Same place, same Uzbek party conference hall. Sharaf, will you have 6 million tons? Without any hesitation, he replied, we will. But they didn't even have 5 million tons, not even 5 million. They just faked the figures.
The cotton targets rose in an atmosphere of self-congratulation. But the land was being poisoned by chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and defoliants. and thousands of peasants were drawn into a web of fear and falsehood.
Let's say the harvest is in and there just isn't enough cotton to fulfill the targets. What the collective farm boss does is, he goes to the head of the cotton factory for help. The farm boss makes a deal to pay so and so much money per ton, effectively buying the cotton back off the factory. The factory boss has no qualms about taking the farm's money because he knows both the party and the civil servant will protect him, cover up for him whenever he needs it. The collective farm president gets the money to pay the factory from the cotton pickers. It's their money. It's the money they should have been paid. He prepares a document, all apparently above board. The cotton workers have to sign for the money, but it's money they've never had.
Ibrahim Buriev tried to blow the whistle. All his protests got him was 5 years in prison. Much later, the Uzbek party was purged, and hundreds of low-level farm managers stood trial. Here, the witness testifies that she did indeed sign for money she had not received. The defendants were convicted of stealing 1,430,331 rubles and 46 kopecks. All over the empire, the demands of the plan put honesty and imagination to the test. Until perestroika, the manager of this factory in Moscow needed formidable powers of invention.
Practically all through the Brezhnev years, the years of stagnation we call them now, it was the same. They gave us totally unrealizable production targets. I did keep proper accounts, but I kept them to myself and kept quiet. And by never dealing in specifics and always using slogans and generalizing, I managed to cover up. Like everyone else, I nodded and smiled, but in reality, we knew. We knew what was coming. But there was nothing we could do about it in those days. Even if you tried, you weren't likely to get very far. They started to hand out medals. They gave out medals for anything, for the 5-year plan, for just about everything. There was nothing else to give. Now we understand what a farce it was, but then we accepted it. We've all got our medals. Well, it was just the system.
During the Brezhnev years, consumer demand was growing fast. To meet it, a flourishing black economy grew up in the shadow of the plan. For years, the government turned a blind eye to the resourceful entrepreneurs who got rich on the side, on the left, as the Russian expression has it. When the crackdown came, it was targeted on the southern republics. In Georgia, on one talented rag trade factory manager.
The workers at the factory were producing goods for the black market. 80% of what they made went to fulfill the plan, and 20% they kept for themselves. They did it by economizing. Say a piece of cloth should weigh 40 to 50, they made it only 35 to 20. So the material was still the same length, but it was thinner than specified by the plan.
It was a crime by the standards of those days. But today we're looking for men like Lazishvili to get the economy going again.
We were just creating new products. It wasn't the atomic bomb we were making. We were simply using existing materials to design goods for which there was a huge demand in the Soviet Union.
The Lazishvili family have plenty to celebrate now they are reunited. After 15 years in prison, he's even got his old job back. The entrepreneurial talents of the Georgian people were not the only problem facing their local communist chiefs in the 1970s. Georgians had not forgotten their brief period of autonomy after the revolution of 1917. They remained a proud and independent people. So when in 1978 the Brezhnev government introduced a new constitution, university students like Vasily Maglaperidze were furious. It included a clause which gave the Russian language equal rights with Georgian.
We were all involved, all my student friends from every faculty in the university. And in those last few days, no one did any academic work at all. The campus was buzzing, just like a giant beehive.
Thousands marched on the government building where the Georgian Supreme Soviet was meeting. The local party was led by an anti-corruption campaigner who had to travel in a bulletproof car. His name was Edward Shevardnadze. Opening the debate on the new constitution, he spoke in Georgian.
Shevardnadze read out the constitution point by point, and he read very slowly, it seemed to me, as if he was trying to stretch the time out. The whole hall knew everyone would be up in arms if the result wasn't what they wanted.
With thousands of students massed outside, the Georgian party leadership was in frantic telephone communication with Moscow, pleading with the Politburo to drop the offending clause and avoid serious trouble. The nod came down from Moscow just in time for the vote.
Konstitucija უდიდესი დემოკრატიული მონოპოლია ყოველი ხალხისა, ყოველი ქვეყნისა. ჩვენ ყველა უფლება გვაქვს თქვათ, რომ საქართველოს ახალი კონსტიტუცია.
After that, we had the definite feeling that we had achieved something. Everyone realized it wasn't independence, but we had shown our strength of will in standing by our opinions. It was, after all, the first time that the government had ever taken back one of its orders.
In the summer of 1980, the Olympic Games came to Moscow. Brezhnev opened an Olympiad boycotted by Western nations. The intervention in Afghanistan had begun the previous Christmas. A decade of war lay ahead. The Moscow Olympics went ahead in celebration of youth and vigor, qualities in short supply in the Kremlin. Leonid Brezhnev during the 1982 elections. His slurred speech betrayed failing health. He had suffered his first stroke in 1976. His illness was kept from the Soviet public by an obedient press and television. Film editors working on newsreels and documentaries found their skills increasingly put to the test. This film was called A Meeting with an Interesting Person.
I've worked a long time at the studio as an editor. And I've had to correct lots of bits of speech. And of course the most difficult person to edit was Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, especially in the last years of his life when he spoke very badly. I mean, he even got letters mixed up in his words. Once he said, "I am a man who service-served at the front." And from something this short, I had to try and cut out the offending letters and put in letters from a different word, so that he said served. But we were thankful when it was only a little slip of the tongue. From Calcutta to Hanoi, he said once. Well, we cut out the D and we got from Calcutta to Hanoi, so that was okay. Then he'd go sort of... Once I had 5 minutes of film and I had to cut out 35 tuts.
There were younger men in the party hierarchy, men like the Agriculture Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, too young for the job when Brezhnev died in 1982. The new General Secretary was Yuri Andropov, filmed here as he took leave of his old colleagues at the KGB.
Я искренне благодарен вам за те теплые слова, которые вы написали, может, и с перебором малость, значит, в адресе. Вот. Но все равно приятно, хоть и с перебором. Мы проработали вместе 15 лет. Всякое было. И трудно было, и успехи были, и неудачи были. Служба наша непростая. Мы боремся. Мы на передовой линии борьбы.
Andropov's leadership gave the first taste of what we now call perestroika. But it wasn't liberalism that moved him. Wherever he looked, he saw lazy, slack, undisciplined behavior. He wanted to kick an idle and drunken labor force into working harder. In accordance with an old Soviet tradition, he assumed that issuing an order would bring results.
Andropov clamped down hard. One of his first targets was the legendary fraud and bribery in the empire's grocery shops. It was a sudden change in policy which led to thousands of arrests and embarrassed huge numbers of party functionaries. The manager of this shop had first-hand experience of the party's attitude before the sudden clean-up.
The party called me in and said, "Why aren't you fulfilling your plan?" And I said, "I don't know. They just don't bring me enough goods." You don't know how to get goods? Ask the other shop directors how they do it. And I said, "I know how they do it. They go to the wholesaler and give bribes." Well, that's not our affair. You just make sure that your shop has a full assortment of goods on sale. And what with that and pressure from my shop workers, from that time on, I started to give bribes. I started to fulfill the plan. They started to praise me.
Rosyakov was already retired when he was picked up by the police. He served 4 years in prison. Some offenders were shot. There was less food in the shops than ever. For the dissidents, too, Andropov's rule meant hard times. After years of struggle, the chronicle of current events was forced to close.
I think it really was the most difficult time, a time of general pessimism. Some of us were in prison, some left the country, some just left the movement. It just wasn't physically possible to do anything anymore. Moscow was empty. Of course, there were still a few kitchens, like this one, where you could talk openly. But that was all. It all felt pretty hopeless. No one paid attention to Sakharov's excellent words. An interviewer asked him, "Do you have any hope?" He replied, "No, probably not. Not for any speedy change. But history's like a mole. It burrows away unnoticed."
Но крот истории роет незаметно.
Andropov had only 15 months to begin the program of reform and discipline.
Дорогие товарищи, в сердцах советских людей глубокой скорбью.
His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, led the mourning at the great state funeral in February 1984. But the new man was himself so ill, he could barely raise his hand in salute.
Председателя Президиума Верховного Совета СССР товарища Константина Устиновича Черненко.
I can't think of anything to say about Konstantin Chernenko except that he lasted just into 1985. And I remember that year well. It was the year a Soviet paper described some of my writing as slime worse than Goebbels. But, like many others, I was eventually rehabilitated. For later in the year, the world discovered a new hero.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together.
The West loved him. He was vigorous, energetic, charming. He said, "We have to achieve a breakthrough. There is no alternative."
Erdogan, do you think you ought to stand on the end of his
All right.
And the world began to change. Not always quite as he expected.